Okay, welcome everybody to this webinar on Interfaith Affirmations on Belongingness. Greetings from a very hot Geneva. My name is Peter Prove. I am Director for International Affairs at the World Council of Churches in Geneva, and we're very, very pleased and honored to have our speakers and, of course, our audience members with us for this important conversation. So this webinar is about statelessness. The situation that people who do not have any recognized nationality that links them to a state find themselves in. With no state that recognizes such people as its citizens, there is no state to whom they can look for their protection, and no state that can be held accountable for the violation of their rights. The human right to a nationality is therefore, in many ways, a right to have human rights. But millions of people around the world do not enjoy their human right to a nationality. They are, therefore, legally invisible to any state authority, and consequently disenfranchised and marginalized. This concern has become a very important priority for the World Council of Churches, and we have worked in close partnership with the UNHCR Statelessness Unit to explore ways in which our member churches and partners around the world can become active participants in a global campaign to end statelessness. Now, most of the world's stateless people have never left their country of birth. They are invisible people in the very same place where they were born and grew up, because they have not been granted nationality by the state they live in. And the main cause of this situation is discrimination, whether it be based on gender, on race, or on religion, or on other characteristics or circumstances. But especially since this webinar is taking place on the occasion of World Refugee Day, it's important to underline that statelessness, that discrimination resulting in statelessness and statelessness itself can be both a cause and a product of displacement. So when the World Council of Churches was founded in 1948, one of its first and most important areas of work was actually assisting refugees from in the aftermath of World War II. It was very actively engaged in bringing relief and advocating for uprooted people since that time up to date. And when we look around the world today with so many conflicts worldwide, be it in Sudan, South Sudan, in Ethiopia, in the Great Lakes region, and as well now, tragically, in Ukraine, and with the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the climate emergency, the plight of displaced people, both refugees and IDPs, is, if anything, more challenging than ever before. Stateless people are particularly vulnerable to forced displacement precisely because of their lack of recognition and lack of protection and lack of access to rights. So in light of all these circumstances, WCC, together with its partners at UNHCR, started a consultation process with religious scholars from different faith traditions to discuss the possibility of an interfaith document which would affirm in common some basic tenets from different religious traditions on belongingness. And after nearly 5 years of consultation and collaboration, we are very, very happy that the affirmations have finally been approved on the 5th of May during a recent meeting of the Multi-Religious Council of Leaders. So today's webinar is an opportunity to discuss with some of the religious scholars who helped to draft these affirmations. We're also going to hear from colleagues at UNHCR, as well as a panelist with lived experience of statelessness about what these affirmations really mean to her as a stateless person. So I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists that we have before us, but more extensive biographies will be pasted into the chat box so that you can read them yourselves. We're going to start with some introductory remarks by way of video messages, firstly from Reverend Professor Dr. Hans Uko, who is the acting General Secretary of the World Council of Churches. He is a priest of the Orthodox Church in Romania and has served over many years in many different responsibilities in the WCC. We will also have a video greeting from Ms. Jillian Triggs, who is Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at UNHCR. And she is stepping in lieu of the High Commissioner Filippo Grandi. Ms. Triggs previously served as President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, my own home country. So I'm delighted to have her with us, albeit by video message. We will then hear from Reverend Dr. Hans Uko, who studied theology in Lund, Sweden, and is an ordained minister of the Church of Sweden. His professional career is in the area of interreligious relations and dialogue, and amongst many other responsibilities he held, he has served as a program executive in this area of responsibility in the World Council of Churches. Then we will hear from Professor Anand Rambhachan, who is Emeritus Professor of Religion at St. Olaf College, Minnesota. He was also visiting professor at the Academy for the Study of World Religions at the University of Hamburg in Germany from 2013 to 2017. And then we will hear from Ekaterina E., who was born in Soviet Central Asia and came to the United States as a child shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. She's been living in the US as a stateless person for more than 2 decades. In 2017, Ekaterina co-founded United Stateless, the first and only US-based human rights advocacy organization led by stateless persons and dedicated to solving statelessness in the US and globally. And we will also hear from Sam Mosalai, who is a legal officer in the Statelessness section at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Sam is responsible for working on the development of legal and policy guidance on statelessness, as well as advocacy to raise awareness on statelessness and its human rights implications. So I think you can see that we have an excellent panel of speakers to take us through this topic. So I would like to start with the recorded video message by Reverend Professor Dr. Hans Uko, Acting General Secretary of the World Council of Churches.
Your Excellency, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Mr. Filippo Grandi, distinguished panelists, sisters and brothers. It is my privilege as Acting General Secretary of the World Council of Churches to welcome you to this webinar on this special day, World Refugee Day. Presently, as we speak, the world is witnessing among the highest levels of displacement ever on record. Close to 100 million people around the world have been uprooted from their home countries to escape disasters and conflicts. World Refugee Day, therefore, holds a special meaning, as it is a moment for the world to acknowledge the personal struggles, stories, dreams, and hopes of people who have been forced to leave their homes and their countries, as well as recognizing their power and resilience to cope under such exceptional circumstances. Stateless people are among the communities most vulnerable to forced displacement. With no recognized nationality that links them to any state, they are all too often a forgotten and invisible group of people. They live on the margins of society, with no practical access to their human rights and little protection in most cases. Discrimination is one of the main causes of statelessness. Millions are stateless today, worldwide, because of nationality laws, policies and practices that discriminate on basis of gender, ethnicity, and religion. When nationality becomes racialized, states sometimes deprive racially identified communities of their right to a nationality. Likewise, religious nationalism has also been a subtext for the exclusion of entire communities from citizenship. During this webinar, we hope that your discussions will particularly evolve around the recently accepted Interfaith Affirmations on Belongingness. These Interfaith Affirmations, developed during the last 5 years by the World Council of Churches in collaboration with various religious scholars and the Religions for Peace, are an invitation to faith leaders to draw upon some basic religious tenets common to all faith communities that can be used when serving and protecting stateless people. We live in multi-religious societies. As living communities of faith, dialogue among the religious communities is a dialogue of humanity. Together, we can build bridges so that our respective efforts for the human rights of stateless people intersect, and so we are able to co-create a world which is friendlier and more open for stateless people to be seen, heard, and especially live in peace, harmony, and dignity. Thank you for joining this webinar, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Reverend Sauka. And now let's hear the short video message by Ms. Jillian Triggs, Assistant High Commissioner for Refugees.
Greetings from the United Nations Refugee Agency to our very distinguished participants and our ecumenical friends. On behalf of all my colleagues here in Geneva and throughout the world, I'm delighted to join you and the World Council of Churches for today's discussion about the Interfaith Affirmations on Belongingness. These affirmations are hugely significant for our shared efforts to end statelessness. The 1948 Declaration on Human Rights, which recognizes that everyone has a right to nationality, was adopted over 70 years ago. Yet millions of people, untold millions, do not yet have citizenship, and they suffer daily the indignities and rights violations as a result. We know the lack of a nationality has grave consequences in terms of people's ability to enjoy other fundamental rights. The Interfaith Affirmations on Belongingness are an inspiring statement of principles acknowledging these rights and the need to end statelessness. Also inspiring is the spirit of cooperation by leaders of diverse faiths which brought these affirmations into being. They remind us that ending statelessness calls for leadership from actors across all societies, and that leaders of faith communities have a very particular ability to advocate within their communities. As religious leaders, you can encourage your communities to set aside discriminatory views and practices, and you can emphasize in your teachings that there are no strangers, as the affirmations proclaim. Your voice as advocates for respect among diverse faiths, to unify rather than divide societies, to promote peaceful coexistence, and to affirm the importance of belonging are absolutely essential. Your leadership can influence all those people who are able to carry out the legal or policy reforms that are needed to end statelessness. World events today remind us that stateless people often face heightened vulnerability in the face of war, of health pandemics, or as a consequence of climate change, where vulnerable people often lack protection that's afforded by citizenship of a particular country. This adds urgency to our shared goals and the need to build on the global progress and the momentum gained in recent years. We've seen many recent accessions by states to the UN Statelessness Conventions over the last decade. Many countries are now incorporating safeguards into their nationality laws to protect children from statelessness, taking steps to ensure access to birth registration, to granting or confirming nationality for communities that have in some cases been stateless for many decades. Several states have removed gender inequality from their nationality laws to give women the right to pass on their nationality on the same basis as men. Importantly, since 2019, over 70 countries have pledged to take action to address statelessness. We think this is a signal of the growing political will to address the issue. Our shared purpose of ending and preventing statelessness is achievable. We can do it, but only through strong partnerships such as this one. So on behalf of all my colleagues at the UN Refugee Agency, I applaud your initiative in creating the Interfaith Affirmations for faith leaders, and I very much look forward to hearing the outcomes of your deliberations. Thank you.
We thank Assistant High Commissioner Triggs for this very generous message. And now I'd like to move to our panel discussion, and in particular to start with Reverend Dr. Hans Uko. As someone who experienced statelessness firsthand as a child, Dr. Uko's contribution in the drafting process was crucial to make sure that the concerns of stateless people were fully encapsulated. So I want to invite him to share briefly, if you would, what it meant for him to be part of this drafting process that led to the Interfaith Affirmations on Belongingness, and also as an expression of interreligious endeavor. Dr. Uko, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I will refrain from walking through the affirmations since you will all be familiar with them. I will only mention 3 points that in a personal way made me welcome the project of Interfaith Affirmations on Belongingness. These points make me, in a particular way, walk back to my childhood and youth. My father was a very secular German Jew who managed to escape the annihilation camps of Hitler, although he had to leave his mother behind. He arrived in Sweden. Here he was stateless. He married a Swedish Jewish woman. I was their only child. Swedish law made me, together with my father, stateless. All this happened when I was too young to suffer any consequences of my statelessness. After some years, my father was given Swedish citizenship, and I followed him. But having lived several years of statelessness, my father had, as the affirmations say, been made vulnerable, and he remained throughout his life pushed into the margins of society. His acquired Swedish citizenship couldn't lift off the burden of statelessness. A feeling of insecurity accompanied his every move. Was he accepted and welcome, or was he only tolerated? Was he, as the affirmations put it, still seen as the other? Did he belong? Statelessness is not as visible as other crimes against humanity. Mostly it is ingrained in the life and work of society, or maybe even in the faith and order of society. It has been justified for so long, generation after generation. The affirmations put it in the following words: statelessness of many minorities has been justified by discourses, stereotypes, and prejudices perpetuated by majorities. Mostly, it is off the radar. It's only when the affliction of statelessness flares up that the world becomes aware of how it really affects its victims. A couple of years ago, we were made witnesses to the plight of Rohingya in Myanmar. We saw it with our own eyes. Usually, statelessness just goes on. It is seldom as tangible as the victims of the civil war and starvation in Yemen, or the repression and imprisonment of the Muslim Uyghur minority in Xinjiang. The statelessness, or the exclusion of people, is ingrained in society, and it easily requires legs of its own. Power relations in society sets from early on a tone of exclusion. Belongingness requires more than legislation against segregation. The worst is that those who are considered not to belong may, even after apartheid is declared null and void, or negative discrimination based on caste was banned by law and enshrined in the Indian Constitution, still not belong. A counterculture of societal values needs to accompany legislation. Steve Bantu Biko said, "The most powerful weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." The same goes for Dalits. The feeling of not belonging is contagious, also among its very victims. You give the oppressor right. Not belonging can remain in your mind long after the end of apartheid or castelessness. Religion contains values. Where is religion in belongingness? Religion is a two-sided reality. It has served the abolition of denigration and slavery, but it has also played a role in making theology or teaching support and perpetuate separation and denigration. Religion is not innocent. Core interpretations of religion easily lend themselves to othering the other. Religion is easily blinded to its role in perpetuating inequality in society. The teaching of chosenness needs to be challenged. Therefore, interfaith affirmations on belongingness needed to be created through multi-religious encounters and reflections. Thinking together can build upon the dreams and visions and experiences and teaching of our religious traditions, positive but also negative. The old ecumenical find of the WCC Faith and Order, the so-called Lund principle, comes to mind faced with the need for addressing with people of different religious tradition and no religion, any teaching, including dogma or doctrine, that provides space for not belonging, exclusion, segregation, ethnocentrism. When it said that which we can do together, we should not do separately. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Uko, and also for incorporating in your presentation your own personal history and testimony that very much undergirds your engagement in this work. Thank you so much. So let's move to our second panelist, Professor Anand Rambhachan, who is one of the co-drafters of the Interfaith Affirmations. Professor Anand, I'd like to ask you to share briefly, if you could, about what Hinduism teaches us in terms of belongingness and non-discrimination, and also how religion can sometimes be instrumentalized, leading to religious nationalism that can result in the deprivation of nationality for others. Professor Rambhachan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and greetings, friends. I am very happy for this webinar today. I was present in Rome with my good friend Hans and others in 2017, when the World Council of Churches, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and the Council for World Mission convened religious scholars from various traditions for a first interfaith symposium on statelessness. It is at this symposium that we identified the need to develop the interfaith affirmations on Belongingness, a unique historical document. And I am honored with others to have had the opportunity to serve as a co-drafter. I want to acknowledge the roles of one of my co-drafters, Reverend Dr. Hans Uko, who just spoke, and Mrs. Segma Asfa of the WCC, who brought in defatigable commitment and energy to the process and to today. Our motivation for these affirmations when we met was the plight of stateless persons, people who are often ignored by the world's religious traditions, and the need we felt as followers of various traditions to speak together on their behalf. Religious traditions cannot be neutral or silent on this matter, affecting the well-being of our fellow human beings. And as we've heard, from our speakers today, stateless people live in a space of diminished worth and dignity, and often with very limited access to the necessities required for healthy physical, mental, and emotional development. The impacts of statelessness often include inadequate healthcare, education, fewer job opportunities, exploitation, exposure to human trafficking. And bereft of legal status, stateless persons live in fear and vulnerability on the margins of society without rights and protection. Children and women are among the most vulnerable victims of statelessness. We discussed at that very first meeting, at least we started to probe the causes of statelessness, some of which have already been mentioned: discrimination on the basis of race, gender, religion, place of origin, ethnicity. But when we think of such causes, as Dr. Uko already mentioned, our religious traditions cannot be exempt from responsibility. In many cases, past and present, such discrimination is legitimized and sanctioned by appeals to religious authority. And so religions often become complicit in definitions of national identity, which privilege some groups and marginalize others, contributing to the causes that justify statelessness. In teaching and in practice, our traditions have not always been faithful to the ideals of human dignity and equal value and inclusivity. And this is especially important when a tradition enjoys majority status in a nation and where minority communities are the victims of discrimination. Religious leaders must exemplify courage and fearlessness in speaking and advocating for stateless persons. In addressing the causes of statelessness, it is important that our traditions acknowledge responsibility and exemplify self-criticism. But we entered into this work also aware of the fact that our religious traditions are rich in theological and moral resources for preventing and overcoming the problem of statelessness. In their distinctive ways, our traditions affirm the dignity of every human being. In the Hindu tradition, for example, from which I speak, human dignity is intrinsic. It expresses the fact that the divine exists equally in all beings. It is the theological reason why we must resist all efforts to deny the personhood of others and their equal worth. We also understand all human beings as belonging to and constituting a single community, having a single divine origin. No one is excluded. And so we must always, from our theological places of meaning, vigorously challenge distinctions, such as between we and they, the in-group and the out-group, the privileged and the marginalized. Such distinctions, as we well know, become the basis for diminishing the value of others. Our traditions have an obligation to speak for all humanity. This is what our traditions can do in this context, and especially for those who are the victims of the injustice of statelessness. And finally, the dignity of all human beings, the fact that we belong to a single human community, are the religious sources of those ethical values that we need in addressing this challenge: compassion, hospitality, responsibility for each other. Our traditions can become partners in the prevention of statelessness by bringing their moral energy and theological insights to these discussions. The vast outreach of our traditions can help spread awareness of the problem, mobilize communities for hospitality, and serve and remind states of their moral responsibilities to those who are stateless. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Anand. And once again, what a privilege it is to have you and Dr. Hans, both parents of this document, of this initiative for the Interfaith Affirmations on Belongingness, to be present with us for this, this webinar. As you mentioned, the origins of this document date back at least to the seminar in Rome in 2017. So it's been a long gestation, but we're very delighted to see now finally this important document having been adopted and having and being, we hope, implemented to the benefit of stateless people. So now I'd like to move to our next speaker and invite Ekaterina E. to share some words. Especially as a young woman with lived experience of statelessness, we would be very keen to hear from you the meaning and the role of these affirmations to you as a stateless person, and also whether these affirmations can help in your activism for the universal right to a nationality. Does such an interfaith stance bring a moral imperative to the fundamental right of a nationality? Ekaterina.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you, everyone. It is a real joy and honor to be here and to be able to share and to listen. First of all, I have to say, I have now reread the affirmations at least 3 times and will probably continue to do so. Statelessness is about expulsion from the human community. It is a very isolating experience. For me personally, being stateless has translated into having been separated from my family, from my mother for almost 30 years. And I do want to add that my experience is in many ways that of privilege due to many factors. I'm living in the relative safety of the United States. I'm not in the war zone. I do have food and shelter. And these days, I do feel a much deeper sense of belonging, largely due to being surrounded by allies and colleagues within my community and the United Stateless advocate community. This said, I cannot deny that there's still moments when, and they do happen, when a certain feeling sets in, kind of abysmal hopelessness. When I read letters from other stateless persons who are going through trauma, I hear their stories, when thinking about world events, or looking at the possibility of how long it may take to actually see real changes. Here in the US, for example, a country with no legal framework to address statelessness. So when I first read the affirmations, I felt profoundly moved. I felt and feel supported and uplifted. I feel seen and recognized. I also want to commend the drafters on including stateless persons in the actual process. Traditionally, impacted people have been largely removed from solutions or decision-making processes. So this initiative reflects a kind of change that is crucial. I also want to say that as an advocate for human right to nationality, I'm also very familiar with the feeling of being up against a kind of monolithic challenge in our work. Nationality is something that most people take for granted. statelessness is not an easy concept to grasp for most people. And in order to make changes, we need people to get it and get it viscerally. In the United States, for example, a country where statelessness shows up mainly in migratory context, we have such a diverse statelessness profile because of the richly varied immigrant community. So trying to paint a picture of who the stateless persons are, explaining statelessness, which is critically important to successful advocacy, that can be very difficult. Stateless people do not easily fit a stereotype. We are people of all races, religions, ethnicities, genders. But one thing that we know, and this is reflected in the stories that are being brought forth over and over, is that discrimination is, in fact, the driving cause of statelessness. And this is relevant in all contexts, migratory or in situ. Around the world, nationality laws and practices that discriminate on the basis of gender, religion, race, or ethnicity set into motion traumatic events that destroy families, rip apart communities, and inflict trauma that lasts for generations. And traditionally, religious and faith community has been such a profound source of strength for people around the world. And unfortunately, as we know all too well, many religious teachings have and continue to perpetuate the very discriminatory practices that and beliefs that create divides between people instead of healing them. So, of course, the affirmations are a profoundly powerful step in the right direction. And I sincerely hope that they will be shared widely and assimilated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ekaterina. That's, I think, must be very moving to people like Professor Anand and Dr. Hans to hear the impact that this document makes on you as a stateless person. And I think it is a real testimony to both the importance and the salience of and utility of having undertaken this step. So we're very much hoping that with you, through you, and along with many other counterparts, we can leverage this document to make a bigger impact in the lives of stateless people. So now I'd like to move to our final panelist in this panel discussion segment. But before I do so, I'd like to remind members of the audience that there will be a reasonable time for questions and discussion following these inputs. So if you have questions that you would like to put to any one or more of the panelists, please put them in the chat box. And my colleague, Segma in particular, I'll be asking Segma to help us harvest any questions that are coming into the chat box that can be presented to the panelists after that. So now I'd like to reintroduce Sam Mosalai from UNHCR and ask you to speak, Sam, about how you think such a document as these Interfaith Affirmations on Belongingness can be important in the work that UNHCR is doing to tackle statelessness globally, including in the context, the current very tragic context of unprecedented levels of displacement around the world. So how can these affirmations be translated in practice into UNHCR's work for the human rights of stateless people? Is this a document that regional or country offices in your system will receive and can use in their respective contexts? Sam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you also to the other speakers, especially those who shared personal experiences. It's always good for us as well at UNHCR to hear from people with lived experiences and to hear their perspectives. Maybe before I answer the question, I would like to also thank the World Council of Churches for organizing the webinar today and for the invitation to UNHCR to speak. We have a very good collaboration with the World Council of Churches, and we're very happy to see the continued engagement on the issue of statelessness. And so today, the 20th of June is World Refugee Day, as was mentioned. So some may wonder, why do we talk about stateless persons? And Peter, you mentioned the links between statelessness and forced displacement, the fact that these concepts or these issues are very much intertwined, that it can be both a cause and a consequence of forced displacement. And you also mentioned the vulnerability that stateless people often face in situations of conflict and war and forced displacement. Without going into too much repetition, I would like to maybe briefly highlight the vulnerability part. We do indeed see that stateless persons are at an increased vulnerability when it comes to forced displacement. And we see it most recently in the context of Ukraine, where all of us have been able to read reports of third country nationals, but also people without documents and stateless populations who have been unable or have faced challenges to seek asylum in neighboring countries. And this is a very good example of how stateless populations, stateless people who don't have the protection of a country, who don't have documentation to prove the link to a country, can face additional vulnerabilities when it comes to situations of forced displacement. We also see that, as I said, the displacement can be a cause of statelessness, and it can create risks of statelessness in certain environment, in certain context. And again, in the context of Ukraine, it may be too early to judge, but one can imagine that the breakdown or the collapse of birth registration systems and civil registration systems and so on creates risks of statelessness, as it becomes more and more difficult for people to prove their link to a country if they don't have the documentation. This is even more the case for minority groups who had to leave a country and may, upon return after a conflict ends or stabilizes, face difficulties to prove their connection to the country. So it's very good to remind ourselves of this, and for that reason, it's also very appropriate for us to have this discussion today on World Refugee Day, to use this opportunity to talk about the links between statelessness and forced displacement and the specific vulnerabilities that stateless people face. And this is clearly very well understood by the World Council of Churches, who organized this webinar today, and who has concerned itself with the issue of statelessness for over a decade now, and even before the I Belong campaign started in 2014. And it's really the only faith-based organization that we're aware of that has picked up the issue of statelessness as one of its thematic priorities. And the engagement of World Council of Churches, SEGMA, and others is truly remarkable. Over the years, we've seen the World Council of Churches taken many practical initiatives to educate its membership, to raise awareness on the issue of statelessness within faith communities through extensive consultations and webinars and capacity building initiatives, and therefore really made great contributions to the common goal of ending statelessness. And in that sense, the WCC has also really been a thought leader when it comes to statelessness in the faith community, taking the lead on the development of various documents. As I said, going back to even before the I Belong campaign started in 2014 to 2011, when the World Council of Churches had organized regional consultations in response to following visits to refugee camps in Myanmar, Bangladesh, the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh, and then again at the High Commissioner's Dialogue in 2012, and then again at the World Council of Churches Assembly in Korea. In 2013. So we see that the engagement of World Council of Churches really goes back a long time, and all the various documents that have been created over the years, also the biblical reflections and the other relevant documents are really at the basis of these affirmations that we're discussing here today. So why are these affirmations important? We think that they do something very critical. They translate what is essentially a legal issue, stateless is essentially a legal issue, but it translates it into something that makes sense from a religious perspective and finds links to religious scripture in the Bible, and therefore it changes legal obligations into moral obligations. And whenever we as UNHR and other stakeholders who work on statelessness try to engage with new partners, we always try to see how do we frame the issue in a way for it to make sense for the people that we're engaging with. And I think the affirmations that we're discussing here today do a really good job at making sense of what statelessness is and making sense of engagement from a religious perspective. And why is it then important for religious organizations to be engaged in the first place? As has been mentioned already by a few of the previous speakers, at the root of statelessness, we find discrimination. We find racism on the basis of various grounds, including religion. And we believe that faith leaders are uniquely placed in a way to address some of these root causes. They're in the communities. They are able to start these conversations, to have these conversations about belongingness, about including other people, about not creating we and them, and really ensuring inclusivity. These affirmations have been already published on our website, the I Belong website. As was mentioned, they have been discussed at the Multi-Religious Council of Leaders not too long ago, which is an initiative from Religions for Peace and UNHCR. And we, as UNHCR, are certainly determined to call on to call attention to these affirmations in various fora. We will be sharing them with our regional officers. So in response to your question, is this a document that we can share with our national and regional colleagues? Yes, definitely. And we will be sharing it with them. And hopefully what it will do is it will help us as UNHCR, as a secular organization, to engage with faith communities all over the world. We can use these to engage with communities in refugee camps in Bangladesh, but we can also use them to engage with people in villages across Europe. So it's a document that really will hopefully help us as UNHCR to extend our reach, and it should also help other organizations, civil society organizations, UN agencies working on the issue of statelessness to extend their reach and to really reach out to different faiths, different communities across the world. Lastly, what I will say is that most recently, and this is just to show the interest that there is for such a document, that most recently I was in Kenya at a civil society workshop that was a month ago, and we noticed that there was a lot of references made by various people from various countries to religious engagement and to the need to engage more with religious organizations and faith-based communities in refugee camps and outside of refugee camps. And that was a good opportunity for me to highlight these affirmations, to say, this is a document that the World Council of Churches, together with Religions for Peace and others, have worked on, have produced, and that you, as civil society organizations, can use in your day-to-day work, in your engagement with religious institutions and religious leaders. So I think that really underlines the importance of these affirmations, a document such as these affirmations, and the discussions that we're having here today. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Sam. Well, indeed, what you've just reported from the workshop in Kenya is a very clear sign of the market, if I can use that term, for a document of this type. So now we have some time for questions and discussion. I think we can allocate 10 minutes or so for that sort of component. And so I'm going to turn to Segma to see if there are any questions that she's been able to gather from the chat thus far.
Thank you, Peter. So far, I have not seen any comment or questions, but maybe they will come later in the conversation.
So in that case, I'm going to ask this is something I like to do when we have these sorts of panel discussions. I'd like to ask the panelists if they have comments or questions to anything that they have heard from their fellow panelists, anything that they would like to explore from what you've heard just now in this series of presentations. Please, Ekaterina.
Thank you, Peter. I just have a quick comment on what Sam just said that really made so much sense to me, and it's really important to recognize. And that is that through these affirmations, we really have an opportunity to communicate an issue that is so difficult to communicate, that is often referred to as this legalese, complicated, inaccessible, unattainable kind of concept. It just brings it right down to a very human level and speaks to the human heart. And that is what these affirmations are doing. So literally, we have an opportunity to launch a very powerful message and to communicate a very powerful message in this kind of vehicle, right through these obstacles and divides, and that is really powerful.
Wonderful, thank you, Ekaterina. Actually, I'm going to ask whether Hans and Anand have any observations that they would like to make, and especially in light of the testimonies we've heard now about the relevance and the importance of this document in which they have played such an important role in helping to create. Do you have any comments you'd like to make, Anand, Hans? Anybody? Hans?
I'm new to this with Zoom, so please be indulgent with me. Well, I think that the word is that I've heard is how does it translate, or how do the words are the words being accompanied by action, or how can we communicate it into not only holding up affirmations, but how can it be part of a program of education, of teaching, of introspection, of multi-faith involvement, and so on. So in this realm, I would like to see how can it, or how is it already being used, utilized, or how could it be put into concerted action and involvement by various stakeholders.
Indeed. Thank you, Hans.
Thank you.
Anand?
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Hans, for that comment. You know, I am very encouraged by what I heard from Sam, and also preceding Sam from Ekaterina, about the significance of the affirmations, and Sam already mentioned what is so encouraging for us, the way in which it was lifted up in the meeting in Africa. This is all really very positive. I think to underline what Hans said, our challenge is how to ensure that this doesn't become just another document that lies around with so many other, well-crafted, well-intentioned, and important documents. How do we ensure, that this document gets the kind of visibility and traction, especially in the religious communities? Because I think, we have to help our traditions see the challenges of statelessness as a significant, urgent matter for religious traditions, and especially because of the values that religious traditions commend. This should be one of the issues at the forefront of religious activism. And secondly, as so many of us said in this discussion. You know, Ekaterina lifted up that point. Dr. Uko lifted up that point. Peter, you also mentioned that point. The fact, right on to the present day, we are seeing the ways in which religions are being invoked and instrumentalized to define national identity, to define belongingness in ways that continue to exclude significant populations. I mean, India is a very, very significant example of what is happening in that case. We have definitions of Indian national identity or Hindutva, which is marginalizing Muslims and other minorities in India, which is privileging citizenship for some groups of refugees and excluding others on the basis of religious identity. So how, after this webinar, Peter, how do we continue this work? How do we continue this work? What are the mechanisms for keeping this issue alive in our interfaith fora, in our interfaith deliberations? How do we get the voices of stateless people a place at the table of these discussions? If not, we would have just produced another significant document, and that's the end of our work. I think we have to see it as the beginning of our work. It's a historically significant document. For the first time, we've had an interfaith statement. It wasn't easy to achieve it, as as Segman Hans would testify. We have been at this for 5 years now, but we have this now. How do we make this a powerful resource for bringing about change? That's, I think, is our challenge.
Splendid, Anand. We're going to come back to that during this webinar, but most importantly, after it. But we do have a question now submitted by Ronnie Daniel, who is asking if there have been any successful experiences, challenges anywhere in international courts, for example, the European Court of Human Rights, on the treatment and violation of the rights of persons who are deemed to be stateless. This maybe is something that Sam could help us with, possibly also Ekaterina, but shall we start with you, Sam?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. The answer is yes, definitely. There have been various judgments by various courts, international, regional, and national courts on the issue of statelessness. We have also decisions from the Human Rights Committee, from the Committee on the Rights of the Child, from other human rights mechanisms that have clearly stated that the right to, because the right to nationality is captured in international law, many human rights treaties. So it's depriving someone of their nationality and thereby leaving them stateless is a violation of international law, if that's done arbitrarily. So yes, definitely there is case law, there's jurisprudence on this issue, and it's rather clear, I would say, that the arbitrary deprivation of nationality is not acceptable in international, regional, national law often as well.
Thanks, Sam. Is there anything you want to add to that, Ekaterina?
Sam pretty much covered it. I would only add that the Universal Declaration for Human Rights states right to nationality as a human right. That's Article 15. So yes, definitely.
But you mentioned that in the United States context, you lack a domestic legal framework for addressing this issue. Do you want to say something more about that?
I'm hopeful that in my lifetime we will see a change. There's definitely an effort underway, and the recent announcement from the Department of Homeland Security from the US government gives us hope that there is a real initiative towards solutions. And having stateless people at the table and being able to provide input and insight from a place of experience, lived experience, I think has been significant, and that has really played into this quite a bit. I think I can say that it's probably one of the most important things that can happen is bringing stateless people into the fold and giving us a chance to speak and to participate. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ekaterina. Okay, I'm going to introduce another element into our program, which wasn't foreseen, and so I'm probably going to get in trouble for it later. But I'm going to actually invite my colleague Segma Asfor to say a few words, because she has been the one who has really been the driving engine within the World Council of Churches and within the ecumenical movement to keep the issue of statelessness front and center in our work and in our priorities. So it's very much due to Segma's own personal commitment and the time that she has invested that we've been able to come to the point that we have. So I'd like to ask whether Segma would be willing to share some thoughts from her experience on the evolution of this work on statelessness, initially through the WCC as an institution with our member churches in the regions, and now expressed in the form of this interfaith affirmations on belongingness. Segma.
Thanks, Peter, for putting me on the spot. The work on the human rights of stateless people, this is something that we have started working on in 2010. The mandate came from our Commission of Churches on International Affairs, who met in Albania and decided that that was an area of work we have to focus on. Not very well known, but still, this is the reason why we have to focus on, because these are people living on the margins or the margins. So in 2011, I was privileged to be part of a small delegation that went to Cox's Bazar at the Myanmar border, and we visited some groups there, including some makeshift camps of stateless people in Kutupalong and another camp. I could not remember the name. And we had a regional South Asian consultation there, bringing refugees, migrants, and also some stateless people. Because in Bangladesh, we also had those living in the Dhaka camp. This was an opportunity to discuss about the issue of statelessness in South Asia. And that led in 2012 to the UNHCR high-level dialogue on faith and protection, which was actually the time where we started working more closely with UNHCR. And since then, our collaboration has been such that they even helped us in crafting the WCC assembly statement on the human rights of stateless people, which gave us the mandate as a programmatic area for the WCC to focus on the work of stateless people. So we have been working together with UNHCR since 2013, where we organized a conference in Washington, DC, and also after that, yearly regional training workshops tailored to the realities and the needs of the regions. And one of these training workshops we organized was in Africa, in Addis Ababa. And the religious leaders who were present at that workshop said that we mostly live in multi-religious societies. And statelessness being an issue that is unknown and unseen, we need multi-faith answers to this issue, not only to make it visible, but also together we are stronger. So this is where the idea of an interfaith conversation around the issue started. And we met in Rome at that first symposium, which was a historic event. We had Hans Uko with us, we had Professor Anand with us, we had Peter, who was facilitating, and many others. And the conversation was so rich and so good that we wanted to have another conference. But rather than a conference, we thought, let's work towards a document, just a common denominator that would unite religious traditions on the issue of belongingness. What can we all say from our various beautiful and unique religious traditions on the issue of being invisible, of being excluded, of being overlooked? because stateless people live in our midst. They're not living outside. They live with our midst, but we don't know they are there because legally speaking, they are invisible. And that's a very, I'm not stateless, but still, this is a very poignant issue because it's about not being recognized. I remember one person we met in Kutupalong camp in Cox's Bazar who said, I've been living in this camp since I was a child. There was no trace of me being born. And when I will die, there will not even be a trace that I died. There will never be a trace that I ever existed. I think this is a deeply disturbing and deeply sad situation. And millions of people whom we don't know how many they are, because we estimate there are around 10 million, but there might be much, much more than that. But since they don't have a legal visibility, we can't trace how many they are, and they are vulnerable to exploitation, to so many other things. So it is our duty as human rights advocates and as activists to make sure that we make them visible, but also we give them the space to speak. We don't want to put the words in their mouths. We want them to come to the table and discuss and present. And we have done that through Skype for those who could not travel because of lack of ID as early as 2013, 2014, and we continue to do. Ekaterina is one of those we have worked with, but also Hans Uko, I was privileged to know and humbled to have him in the process as well, and many more we hope. Statelessness is a technical and difficult issue. This is why when we present it to our constituency and other networks, we need to present it in a language that is accessible, that makes sense. As World Council of Churches, we work with churches, so we need to speak a language that churches and people of faith, of Christian faith, would understand. And that would be through biblical reflections, that would be through theological reflections, and this is why we have developed some publication on the issue of statelessness, but from biblical understanding. When we talk about birth registration, this is not something new to not only Christian tradition, but other traditions. Registering important life events is something that any religious tradition has done, because we mark we have rituals for marking important life events. When a child is born, there is a ritual. In the civil world, it's called civic registration. But for us Christian, it's baptism. I'm sure it has another significance in another tradition. When someone gets married, that's also recorded in different religious tradition, just like it is in the civic registry. So I think we need to advocate for the complementarity of these both worlds, so that when in remote areas it's difficult to register the birth of a child, at least we can take the documents that celebrated that birth, be it a baptismal record or any other document, and use it to help establish a birth certificate. I'm sure there is some collaboration that can take place, and we need to advocate for those.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sigma. That was actually very helpful to have that more detailed background introduced into this conversation. I just want to acknowledge that we did actually have a follow-up question in the Q&A from Ronnie Daniel in light of the responses to his previous question. So now the question is, so the problem is political rather than legal. That is a lack of political will to deal with this problem. But I think, Ronnie, that especially when we hear about the lack of a legal framework in the United States to address this issue, it's both. I think it depends on the context as to whether it's a legal or a political problem, but no doubt it is both. But maybe, Sam, you could give us a brief summation of where you see the obstacles really lying.
Yes, I mean, definitely. When I think we can say that it is a political problem as well. We know that to solve legal issues, we need political will. So we see that there is statelessness because there is gaps in nationality laws, but then without the political will of the government to act on these gaps, we won't see them resolved. While in practice they may be very easy to resolve, right? It may be very easy to include a safeguard into a nationality law and say this is how we prevent children from being born stateless in our territory. But if there's no political will from the government to do that, then that's not gonna happen. And then how simple the problem is, doesn't matter. So yes, definitely, it's a combination of political and legal. Essentially, we need to to convince governments to act on these issues. We see that sometimes governments and stakeholders are not aware of some of the issues that are at play. In these cases, it's bringing it to their attention may already be enough, or may already have a big impact. But we also have, and this is also linked to your previous question, we have context where there is a very specific or very targeted effort to deprive people of their nationality. And in these cases, no matter what international law says, or no matter what court judgments there are, the government is not gonna change their actions necessarily if they have a very specific idea of what they want to achieve within their country when it comes to nationality. And we've seen this, of course, in Myanmar with the Rohingya. So I mean, obstacles, I think ultimately it comes down to addressing the root causes. We need to be able, or try to get to the root causes and address the discrimination that underlines these issues. This means investment in peaceful coexistence in countries. This means really being on the ground and making sure that we include people and we facilitate conversations between different groups and different ethnicities and so on. To prevent the deprivation and statelessness from happening, deprivation of nationality and statelessness from happening, because ultimately we see it's on a sliding scale from discrimination to deprivation of nationality to genocide, and so definitely addressing the root causes is key, is probably one of the most important things that we need to do. How do we do that? It's advocating with governments, advocating with the general public, with civil society, to try and move governments to act. But yes, there's many challenges. We see an increase in ethno-nationalism. We see an increase in forced displacement, as we explained, that is also linked to statelessness and that can cause risks of statelessness. So these issues need to be addressed for us to be able to address statelessness, to effectively resolve and prevent statelessness.
Great, thank you very much, Sam. So I'm going to begin to move towards wrapping up this webinar now, and I'm going to do that by asking the panelists to answer just a couple of very brief questions, each one in order. But I am conscious of the fact that in most cases, if not all, you've actually already answered these questions in your presentations. Nonetheless, by way of maybe summarizing some key points, I'd like to ask each of you to tell us what is your hope with regard to these affirmations, to this document that has been produced, and how would you like to see the document and the content that it contains used in practice in the future. So I'm going to start in order of the panelists and start with Dr. Uko. Hans, over to you. You'll have to unmute, Hans.
I have
there
to
we go.
unmute.
There we go. You're right.
Is it okay now?
It's perfect now.
Okay, unmute myself. No, leave.
No, you're good. Go ahead. You can talk.
Okay. Yes, I understand now why I am retired, because I find myself in a new universe where such issues of unmute myself and mute myself are so far away from my universe. Anyway, I wanted to inform myself, maybe, so because I don't know. Would there be a list from each country or from countries, what is the statelessness issue, particularly in that country? Maybe it exists, maybe one cannot make it, maybe there are several reasons, but I meant that highlighting that I mean, we know of, like we said about Myanmar, Rohingya, and there are others, but like Katarina mentioned about the US. What is it that is the issue and the root causes, and what are the responses when a person like you would challenge the legislators and so on, so that one could give visibility to the issue at stake, and also maybe then encourage local volunteers to take up the issue, so that it is not only, how should I say, statelessness activists, but that it becomes a community issue and even a multi-faith issue and human issue, interhuman issue, to get some body or some legs to the issue at stake. So that is maybe both my hope and regarding Peter's question, and of course, whether it is at all possible to do. So I think what I'm looking for is how can I contribute to making these affirmations, as Anand said, not only another document, but really put into like listing issues, deciding on statelessness in several countries, member churches, and the UN members, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so thank you, Hans. You've posed another question, which I think is worth actually soliciting a response to before we move on to closing statements. So I don't know whether Sam, I think Segma might also be able to respond, but Sam, do you want to?
Yeah, I could say something briefly. We don't have as UNHCR, we don't have an overview of all the countries in the world and all the issues related to statelessness in these countries. We do have several documents that can be useful that you can find on our website, the referral page, and one of them could be the pledges that were made by various countries. They indicate to some extent what the issues are in these countries, but that would be limited only to the countries that have shown political will to act. So that would exclude some of the major stateless situations in the world. But we also are in the process of, as UNHCR, developing fact sheets for not all countries, but 33 priority countries that we have identified as priority countries for the remaining years of the I Belong campaign, so until 2024. This includes the US as one of the countries, and these fact sheets have more detailed information on the root causes, the challenges, the numbers, if available, pledges made, partners working on the issue and at the national level. So we have these fact sheets for 33 countries, so they can be very useful for others to look at, to familiarize themselves with the issue. And then, in the European context, I'm thinking along the European context, we have the European Network on Statelessness, which has the European Network on Statelessness database, which is a very detailed database of European countries and the issues that are at play there. We don't have such a database or such information available for other regions, as far as I'm aware. But yeah, as I said, I think probably the most useful thing for people who are interested to do is to look at our website, but there's also other organizations, Institute for Statelessness and Inclusion, and others who have documents on their websites in which you will find information on the statelessness situation in specific countries. And
Sam, maybe you could pop a link to your existing resource page into the chat box just for everybody to see. And in the meantime, I'll get Segma also to respond to this question. Segma?
So the question about how this affirmation will be used, right? Or Hans' question.
Sorry, no, I thought you had something to say about the listing of countries, relevant countries situations.
No, it's
okay.
more the general question.
Yes, then we'll come back to the general question. Okay, so the link to the RefWorld page is in the chat box, as is the link to the Institute on Statelessness webpage, which provide resources for that will respond to this question. So let's come back to closing statements in response to those two very simple but very important questions. What is your hope for the future, for these affirmations, and how would you like to see them used in the future? So I think Hans has already expressed his sentiments in this regard, unless he wants to add.
Well, I could very well imagine that one could make a project or a program that would, I mean, if I speak for the World Council of Churches, could one encourage, support member churches to take on board the issue of statelessness, not as a phenomenon or a reality, but actually as something where the statelessness in my country would be articulated. What is it that prevents people from being entirely part of society? What is the statelessness? Who are the stateless in my country and alongside or next to the member churches and so on? So something concretely localized, if that is possible. I realized that I should read what you, Sam, said, and which is very informative, so before speaking about it, but I think I would like to very much read it with those glasses on that I just made use of.
Thank you very much, Hans. Well, you know, with a global assembly of the World Council of Churches coming up a little bit later this year, we have, of course, a big opportunity, maybe also a big threat with regard to the continuation of this this work. So even retired people can help organize lobbies, and we encourage you and anybody who would like to see this work continued and intensified. Please make use of that forum. Anand, your closing thoughts.
Thank you, Peter, for the opportunity to add a final sentence. I think, you know, we've had a very good discussion today. We talked about the challenge of statelessness as having multiple causes and therefore requiring cooperation around a wide body of agencies, legal, political, and otherwise. But I think that what our affirmations bring in a very special way to this discussion, and I'm hoping that this is what it will continue to do wherever it is used, is to also speak of statelessness as a moral challenge, as a moral problem. It is political, it is indeed legal, but I think it is also moral. It challenges our values. It forces us or challenges us to think, who are we as a human community? What is our self-understanding? What is it that causes us to define communities in ways that exclude and marginalize and ostracize and denigrate and exclude others? So it also raises these fundamental questions of values, both, you know, bringing that discussion both to those who, you know, speak to it from political and legal places of meaning. But those values are also challenging values for our religious traditions. You know, how do we, as we said, how have we been contributing to the divisions that perpetuate and continue to cause statelessness? So I feel that it is really important, and I think this document does it, or at least it begins that discussion, to bring the moral light, the moral vision, the moral foundations to any discussions about statelessness, because I think this is also at the heart of the problem. It starts with how we define ourselves as human beings, and how do we see our fellow human beings. You know, why is it that our care, what is it that causes compassion and care to have boundaries? privilege some and delegitimize the needs and concerns of others. So I hope that our document will lift this moral challenge wherever it is used and wherever the tables of discussion are to be found. Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Anand. Ekaterina, your closing thoughts.
Thank you. My hope is that we have more of these conversations and we hold more of these kind of discussions. And this is just the beginning. I also would like, for these discussions to continue to bring it into account the fact that while statelessness is very much about nationality and lacking nationality, nationality does not always guarantee protection of human rights. And remembering that is very important, especially if you belong to a community that is being marginalized or excluded, or you belong to an identity group that is facing discrimination. So that is a really important thing to remember. And ultimately, in addition to hoping for more discussion around this, I hope that the affirmations, like I said, serve as a vehicle for hope, for continued collaboration, and help inspire to bring about the kind of change that will not only help us address statelessness, but help us gain a deeper understanding of what belonging means for all human beings. And thank you.
Splendid. Thank you very much, Ekaterina. Sam, your closing thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Peter. And very similar to what Ekaterina said, it's our hope that these affirmations will inspire action by religious and faith-based actors in different contexts, and use this document as a tool to have conversations in their community around the issue of statelessness and about belonging and the other and embracing the other. So that's our hope, really, and maybe more concretely for us as UNHCR, we're in the process of setting up a global alliance, which is to follow the I Belong campaign post 2024, and that global alliance will bring together different stakeholders, UN agencies, civil society organizations, potentially governments, stateless activists, persons themselves, and hopefully also faith-based organizations. So maybe these affirmations can also help us to facilitate their engagement in that process of setting up the global alliance and taking the work forward post 2024. And we're in the process of consultations with various stakeholders, and we hope to also consult with religious leaders and religious organizations and faith-based organizations. So that's something to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. Well, I think very appropriately, the last word falls to you, Sigma, to give us your thoughts and your hopes for the next steps in this work to eliminate statelessness.
My hope with this document, the affirmations, is that each and every one of you who are present on this panel will make it known to your respective circles. My hope is that UNHCR, for instance, since this is a document we prepared with you, you will share it with your regional and national offices, so that when they work with stateless people and faith communities, this is a document they can refer to because it has recognition by most religious traditions. So we hope that whenever there is a concern in the work on statelessness that your colleagues are doing on the field, in the regions, as well as at the grassroots, we can say these are documents drafted by people from your religious traditions as well, and they acknowledge the right to belong, the right to a nationality, to so many others. Hannah Arendt said that nationality is the right to have rights. It is a threat. Nationality is a threshold, right? And statelessness is the loophole of the Westphalian state system, and we have to challenge that. As Anand said, because we are religious organizations, we have a moral obligation to challenge that on a moral level as well. So if Anand and Hans, also with your respective circles of religious scholars, you can make those aware. There's more discussion around those. This will give life to the document as well. And last but certainly not least, Ekaterina, through United Stateless and other similar organizations like State Free, created in Germany by another group of stateless people, make these documents known so that you know that religious leaders are on your side. You know, this is a document for you, designed by people who have lived experience as well. And we hope that it will make things better, and hopefully we can eradicate statelessness. And I hope that the global alliance that UNHCR will set up in a few years, as Hans said, there will be more information about country specific situations for people to know if there is statelessness in one specific country, why there is statelessness, what is the estimate. And then this document could be available on that fact sheet. And then people could at least have this information, because the lack of information also is a challenge when working on statelessness. So these are just my 2 cents. Thank you, Peter.
Very good. Thank you so much, Sigma. Well, in closing words, I simply want to maybe bring again to the fore the way in which Professor Anand expressed the contribution of this document, this Interfaith Affirmations on Belongingness. And I think that it does indeed bring the issue out of the technical realm, beyond the legal and the political challenges, to a more fundamental moral challenge. And I think that that possibly is its key contribution to this ongoing work, and this very important and essential work to give dignity and belongingness and identity to all those who presently lack it. So I want to thank all the panelists, and including, of course, with very great respect to Assistant High Commissioner Triggs and to Acting WCC General Secretary Professor Sauka for their recorded messages, and of course to all participants, all members of the audience of this webinar. And again, my special thanks to my very dedicated colleague Sigma for leading this work and bringing us all together in this way. So I thank you very much for your participation. Wish you all the very best, and declare this webinar closed. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Everyone.